He wasn't just another passenger in a tailored suit. He was the man who funded the sky beneath the wings of Stratus Air. Yet tonight, seated in 1A, Darius Coleman was served something far colder than the lukewarm sandwich on his tray. Disrespect, wrapped in indifference. He had pre-ordered the lobster bisque and filet mignon, but when the flight attendant handed him a cheap sandwich and offered tap water with a shrug, it wasn't just a meal that was denied. It was dignity. Around him, white passengers clinked champagne flutes, devouring caviar, while the only black man in first class was treated like an afterthought. But what no one realized, not the smirking flight attendant, not the oblivious crew, not the boardroom executives counting miles and margins, was that Darius Coleman wasn't a man you overlooked. 10 minutes later, the message was sent. The audit began, and the entire cabin crew was already finished. They just didn't know it yet. This wasn't a tantrum, it was a reckoning. Before we dive into this shocking story of silent power and overdue justice, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. The soft whir of the engines filled the cabin, a lulling background sound that soothed most first-class passengers into comfort. But not Darius Coleman. He sat still in seat 1A, his posture perfect, his gaze fixed forward, though his thoughts were anything but calm. The sting of what had just occurred still echoed in his mind. It had been subtle, intentional, a decision not made in error, but in assumption. The flight attendant, Brent according to his name tag, had approached with a forced smile and a menu he never intended for Darius to use. When Darius politely requested the lobster bisque and filet mignon, Brent's expression had momentarily tightened before reverting to something rehearsed. "I'm sorry, sir," he had said, his tone laced with hollow courtesy. "The luxury options are unavailable. You'll need to select from the standard offerings." Darius had raised an eyebrow, calm but inquisitive. "I pre-ordered." Brent's shoulders lifted in a nonchalant shrug. "Must not have gone through. It happens." Then he walked away. Just like that. Darius wasn't a man unfamiliar with the coded language of exclusion. He had lived a life where assumptions followed him like shadows. From boardrooms where he was mistaken for security, to luxury hotels where staff asked if he was lost. But this time, it wasn't just about him. It was about what his silence could reveal. He looked around. The other men in first class, 6 in total, were all white. Their suits crisp, their accents polished, their laughter unrestrained. Champagne flutes clinked, caviar was spooned delicately onto blinnies, and fine dining service continued uninterrupted. Only his table was bare, except for the paper-wrapped sandwich and the glass of lukewarm water. No apology, no effort to correct the mistake. Just the kind of polite disregard that had followed black professionals like a shadow for generations. Darius rested his fingers gently on the tray table. He didn't touch the sandwich, not out of pride, but out of principle. To eat it would be to accept the narrative being offered to him, that he didn't belong, that his presence was an anomaly, that his expectations were unreasonable. But he wasn't angry, not outwardly. That would have been too easy. He knew exactly what they would expect. A raised voice, a dramatic confrontation, a demand for a supervisor. And in doing so, he would become the very stereotype they had silently cast him into. The difficult customer, the entitled outsider. He had other plans. As he stared out the window, the clouds below soft and endless, he allowed the weight of his position to anchor him. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a shareholder, a silent architect behind Stratus Air's international expansion. A man who had helped rescue the airline from bankruptcy 5 years ago, pouring in capital and strategy when everyone else had walked away. He had seen their internal culture reports. He had approved their diversity audits. He had personally signed off on the very first-class cabin he now sat in. And yet here he was, reduced to a second-tier customer in a cabin he helped design. It wasn't about the food, not really. It was about what the food represented: priority, recognition, inclusion. His seat number might as well have been stamped in gold, but it meant nothing without the respect it was supposed to carry. Darius pressed the service button again, not to complain, but to observe. He wanted to see how the next moment would unfold, whether Brent would return with accountability or with another dismissive brush-off. Moments later, another flight attendant appeared. This one older, more polished, likely the lead on duty. "Yes, sir?" he asked, voice even but cautious. "I'd like to inquire again about the meal situation," Darius said, his tone measured. "I pre-ordered the lobster and steak, and I'd like clarification on why I wasn't served." The attendant didn't falter, but Darius saw the flicker. A quick glance toward Brent, who stood chatting with one of the white passengers just 2 rows down, laughing at something he clearly found more important than his job. "I believe we had an issue with our inventory system," the older man offered, "and sometimes we have to prioritize certain guests. I hope you understand." The words fell like ice. Prioritize certain guests. Darius didn't blink. He simply nodded, eyes unreadable. "Of course." The attendant moved on, and Darius picked up his tablet, not to draft a complaint, but to initiate a chain of events no one in that cabin was prepared for. Within minutes, his assistant, Marcus Brandt, received the message. Encrypted, precise. Initiate internal audit. Flight 917. Pull staff IDs. Review passenger service footage from 21:30 to 24:45. Discrepancy report expected. Priority high. Back in New York, Marcus didn't hesitate. The wheels of justice had been set in motion. Not loudly, not with vengeance, but with the cold efficiency of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command a storm. Darius Coleman leaned back in his seat. The crew had made a mistake. They had served the wrong man the wrong meal on the wrong day. And now the silence that had once insulated them would be the very thing that buried them. The plane soared over the Atlantic, but inside the cabin of Flight 917, a different kind of altitude was building, one not measured in feet, but in stakes. Darius Coleman remained still in seat 1A, his face an unreadable mask of elegance. Behind his silence, however, was a system awakening. Every keystroke sent from his tablet had already triggered a reaction. It was no longer about the sandwich. It was about the rot underneath the silver service. In New York, Coleman Global's headquarters had gone into silent motion. Marcus Brandt, Darius's chief of operations, wasn't just an assistant. He was a former cybersecurity strategist, trained in protocol analysis and emergency escalation. By the time Darius had finished his glass of lukewarm water, Marcus had already decrypted the flight manifest, flagged Brent's personnel file, and begun triangulating 3 complaints that had previously been closed due to insufficient detail. Each complaint was disturbingly similar. A first-class customer, described as minority male, non-typical luxury flyer, or questionable upgrade, had reported vague but familiar incidents: downgraded meals, less engagement from staff, cold responses to reasonable requests. Each time, Brent's name had been buried under collective crew responsibility. But this time was different, because now Brent had humiliated not just a customer, but a major shareholder, a boardroom kingmaker, a man whose influence wasn't decorative, it was systemic. Back on the plane, Darius sat with his legs crossed, fingers poised over his screen, reviewing a dossier on Brent Callahan. Age 36, hired 9 years ago, promoted to senior flight service supervisor 2 years prior. Unofficial mentor to new hires, known internally as old school. He had been flagged once for referring to a Nigerian diplomat as passport royalty in a closed crew chat room. The HR team had dismissed it as humor. Darius didn't smile. His fingers moved again. This time he typed a new message to Marcus: pull internal crew chat logs from last 48 hours. Scan for terms. Priority. Special meal. 1A. Flag any pattern indicating deliberate exclusion. He wasn't going to wait until the flight landed. He would unravel this while still in the air. From the seat beside him, a junior executive seated in 1B, unknown to Darius, glanced his way and noticed the quiet storm brewing. The younger man had sensed something was off earlier, but now the tension in the air was unmistakable. The sharpness in Darius's expression was that of a man who saw every thread in the fabric and had already begun pulling it. "Is everything all right, sir?" the junior exec asked carefully. Darius turned his head slowly, offered a polite nod, and said, "It will be." That was all. 2 words, but they landed like a promise. Meanwhile, Marcus received an alert from the Stratus Air internal AI log monitor. It flagged a message from Brent sent just before boarding. "We've got another 1A tonight. Looks like he dressed for economy. Oh, well, guess we're out of lobster again, boys." A screenshot, a timestamp, a thread of laughing emojis followed from two other crew members. Marcus's stomach turned. He didn't even hesitate this time. He opened the emergency conduct protocol channel, usually reserved for in-flight incidents such as violence, terrorism, or emergencies. The channel allowed for real-time HR intervention once the plane landed and could escalate to the board if a shareholder was involved. He uploaded the screenshot, attached Brent's past incident files, and included Darius's internal rank within the shareholder structure. The subject line read, "Escalation Protocol, Flight 917, Discrimination Allegation, Shareholder Impact." He hit send. 20 seconds later, the CEO of Stratus Air saw it. By then, the entire executive team was tagged. The internal Slack channel, usually sleepy on a weekend, lit up in quiet panic. Back at 38,000 feet, Darius's phone buzzed gently. Marcus. Confirmed. Chat logs match exclusion pattern. Crew joke about 1A downgrade. CEO looped in. HR dispatching intervention team in Geneva. Darius exhaled slowly. Still calm. Still unreadable. But now his eyes shifted. He watched Brent move down the aisle again, refilling the wine of a businessman in 1C, laughing at a joke, his movements confident, unaware. Unaware that every word he had typed in mockery had now become evidence. Unaware that the man sipping water quietly in 1A had just rerouted his career. Unaware that the very system Brent had gamed was now awake and watching. Darius unlocked his screen again, pulled up the airline's pilot surveillance system, a system he had helped install to improve passenger safety and monitor service equality. He submitted a final request. Flight 917, first class cabin, footage and audio, 2130 to 2400. Prioritize seat 1A interactions. The system would extract it, review it, archive it, but more importantly, it would verify everything. He looked up again. Brent walked by without making eye contact, the same dismissive stride, the same ignorance. Still convinced nothing would happen, still sure that his laugh was louder than Darius's silence. But silence, Darius knew, had its own kind of roar. As Flight 917 cruised silently above the Atlantic, the rot began to reveal itself, layer by layer, system by system. Darius Coleman wasn't just reading signals. He was exposing an entire culture buried beneath airline smiles and scripted courtesy. The cabin's lighting dimmed for mid-flight rest, but inside Darius's tablet, the screen burned with information. The internal chat transcripts were worse than anticipated. It wasn't just Brent Callahan. There were patterns, recurring phrases used among crew members, priority passengers, make it subtle, seat code profiling. One particularly chilling thread was a crew member joking, "If 1A ain't pale, we downgrade the kale." That wasn't just bias, it was a system. Darius's pulse remained steady, but the weight behind his calm sharpened. He typed another message to Marcus. "Build dossier. Tag 3 most frequent collaborators in exclusion behavior. Cross-check with complaint records, include timestamps." Marcus responded almost instantly. "Underway, suggest simultaneous review with executive ethics officer. This isn't isolated, it's institutional." Darius's next command was blunt. "Prepare for restructure proposal, add systemic correction clause." He was done with personal insult. He was dealing with a company culture. The footage request had also been fulfilled. The pilot surveillance system, normally used to resolve disputes between staff and high-profile passengers, was discreetly embedded behind cabin panels, unnoticeable to the naked eye. Darius had helped fund and pilot the initiative. Now it had caught its first undeniable proof. The footage from earlier in the flight showed Brent reading the passenger manifest with visible disinterest, glancing toward Darius without acknowledgement, then turning to his fellow crew member and saying, "Guy in 1A doesn't look like Geneva Club. Let's keep it simple tonight." The video showed him actively moving one of the luxury meals marked for 1A into a storage tray, then walking it over to a passenger in 1C instead. He had made a decision, not a mistake. A decision, and it had been caught. Back at Stratus Air's Geneva Operations Center, HR officer Amelia Rourke, newly promoted and widely regarded as one of the few voices for equity on the executive floor, reviewed the footage on a secure loop. Her fingers hovered above the pause button as she watched Brent smirk when offering Darius the alternate meal. Her eyes narrowed. She opened a file titled ECP Emergency Crew Protocol and began populating it with formal statements of breach, procedural violation, and misconduct with evidence attached. Meanwhile, Marcus had completed the data crossmatch. 37 incidents, 16 involving the same 4 crew members, all flagged by minority passengers, all dismissed. The implication was unavoidable. The HR department had not just failed to investigate, it had quietly participated in the culture of erasure. Marcus filed a secondary report, this time to the board's internal compliance council. He flagged HR senior manager Daniel Reyes for pattern dismissal. Attached were emails where Reyes had downplayed complaints as misunderstandings, unsubstantiated, or social perception errors. No longer. Darius's dossier was now over 70 pages deep. He tapped a button on his screen and opened a new folder titled Flight 917, Culture Audit Phase 1. He knew what came next. If a company couldn't police itself, it had to be rebuilt from within. It wouldn't just be a reprimand, it would be a purge. On the plane, Brent passed again, glancing at Darius with the smugness of someone who believed the moment had passed. But Darius didn't even look up. He didn't have to. Brent didn't know it yet, but he was walking through the ashes of his own career. And Darius had already begun preparing the fire that would consume the rot behind him. Inside Geneva's private terminal, the HR response team was assembling quietly. No headlines, no press, just silence and steel. Their mission: intercept Flight 917, detain the entire first-class service crew, conduct immediate interviews under surveillance, and enforce emergency separation if substantiated. Marcus's message came through again. Board member Davis has viewed the dossier. Verbally authorized interim suspension for Callahan and crew. Says your discretion on permanent removal is final. Darius read it once, then typed, confirmed termination protocol, no appeals, board ratification to follow. This wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability. And justice, true, effective justice, required decisiveness, quiet, efficient, unmistakable. Suddenly, the PA system on the plane crackled. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Geneva shortly. Please ensure your seats are upright, tray tables stowed. The usual tone, the usual script. But Darius heard something else beneath it, a shift in energy, a storm approaching. He watched Brent one final time, still smiling, still oblivious. And in that moment, Darius realized the most powerful truth of all. Some men are destroyed not by force, but by their own unawareness. The plane dipped through the clouds. The landing gear extended. The countdown had begun. As the plane descended into the glowing twilight of Geneva, a subtle transformation began, not in the flight crew, not yet, but in the cabin itself. For while Darius Coleman had known exactly what was happening and what would come next, there were others on board who had also been watching, silently, uneasily, and now they were awakening. Seated across the aisle from Darius in seat 2C was Bernard Langford, a senior partner at one of London's most prestigious law firms, a white man in his late 60s with a taste for Mont Blanc pens, Bordeaux reds, and vintage ethics that rarely updated. Bernard had noticed everything. He'd seen the denial of the luxury meal, the look on Brent Callahan's face, the way the cabin's energy shifted whenever Darius was acknowledged, or rather, when he wasn't. Bernard didn't usually interfere, but this time, something about it stuck in his throat like a bone. He looked over at Darius, who was calmly reviewing his presentation slides again, expression unreadable. Bernard's mind wandered back to the years he'd spent defending corporate interests, excusing unintentional bias, spinning narratives that would now make him ashamed. There was nothing unintentional about what he'd witnessed tonight, and he wasn't the only one. A few rows back in 4A, Rachel Yun, a tech entrepreneur from Singapore, had noticed the shift too. She had boarded with no expectations other than peace and legroom, But now she watched the cabin with new eyes. Her father had told her stories of being denied entry to hotels in his youth. She had never imagined she'd see that same subtle exclusion play out in the skies, in first class, of all places. She had heard the attendant's tone. She had seen the switch in menus. And she had recognized the look on Darius's face, the same one her father wore the night he was asked to show ID twice at his own company's gala. Rachel opened her notes app and began typing, Flight 917, incident log. Racial discrimination in first class? She wrote down the details. Brent's name, the meal denial, the uneven service, the discomfort. She wasn't sure what she'd do with it yet, but she knew one thing. Silence was complicity. In 3B, Dr. Elijah Keene, a professor of sociology from Howard University, felt his chest tighten as he watched it all unfold. He had just returned from a global summit on ethics in business and had given a speech on the consequences of systemic bias. And here he was, witnessing it firsthand, in real time. It wasn't just what had been done, it was how many people had pretended not to notice, but not this time. He reached into his bag, pulled out a slim moleskin journal, and began documenting the incident from his own academic lens. This, he wrote, is a case study in micro-exclusion and racial devaluation at altitude. His hands moved quickly, almost shaking. He hadn't planned to bear witness today, but some moments choose you. Meanwhile, in the back galley, flight attendant Maya Ruiz, a junior staff member shadowing the crew for her 6th probationary flight, stood frozen. She had heard Brent's remark earlier, the one that made her gut twist. 1A's not our kind of guy. At the time, she had smiled nervously, not sure how to respond. She was new. She didn't want to rock the boat. But now, as she peeked into the cabin and saw Darius sitting in quiet strength, she felt shame rush through her like a fever. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse. And somehow that made it worse. Maya turned to face the beverage cart, her reflection faint in the chrome panel. She had joined the airline because she believed in hospitality, in dignity, in making passengers feel at home, no matter who they were. But tonight, she had watched the opposite happen, and she hadn't stopped it. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away. This wasn't over. She pulled out her crew-issued tablet and discreetly opened the internal feedback app, a tool rarely used by junior staff. She hesitated for only a moment before typing, Report, Flight 917, staff misconduct observed. Senior attendant Brent Callahan intentionally reassigned luxury meal from 1A, black male passenger, despite pre-order. Repeated derogatory remarks overheard. She hit submit. The system time-stamped it, logged it, sent it. Now it was part of the record. Across the cabin, Darius Coleman felt the subtle shift, not just in the crew, in the passengers, in the air itself. He didn't know about the report Maya had filed, or Rachel's notes, or Dr. Keene's academic journal, or Bernard's internal reckoning. But he sensed the stirrings of something rare, conscience, the kind that begins when the bystanders stop being bystanders. As the plane touched down on the Geneva tarmac and the landing gear hissed beneath them, the cabin lights blinked softly, like an awakening. The wheels were already in motion, but now the witnesses were moving too. The runway lights flashed past the windows in rhythmic precision as the aircraft rolled to a halt. Darius Coleman sat perfectly still in his seat, his expression unreadable, his breath slow, his thoughts razor-sharp. The descent was complete, but his mission was only beginning. Back at Stratus Air's Geneva terminal, the HR team had already been mobilized. Marcus Brandt's message, footage verified, witness statements emerging, was the final confirmation Darius needed. The chain of events had transitioned from suspicion to substantiation. He rose from his seat slowly, unhurried, like a general surveying a battlefield that had already been won. His polished shoes tapped against the floor as he moved down the jet bridge, flanked silently by 2 airline executives who'd received express instructions from the board. Neither dared speak. Darius didn't need an entourage. He needed action. Behind him, passengers filtered out, some with polite nods, others avoiding his gaze. But a few lingered. Dr. Elijah Keene, for one, made a point to step toward Darius as they entered the terminal's private corridor. Mr. Coleman, he said softly, extending his hand. I don't know if you noticed, but I saw everything, and I'm documenting it. Not for gossip, for reform. Darius paused, shook his hand. Thank you, he said simply. Truth needs record keepers too. Two other passengers followed quietly. Bernard Langford, the aging lawyer, and Rachel Yun, the tech founder. They didn't speak right away, but their presence, solid, intentional, spoke volumes. Rachel handed Darius a folded sheet of paper. Timeline, she said. I documented everything. Timestamps, dialogue, even gestures. It's yours. He took it, nodded. You didn't have to. But I did, she replied, because someday someone might do the same for me. That sentence lingered in Darius's mind as they entered the executive suite near the customs hall, a place he usually used for quiet pre-meeting preparation. Today, it would serve as a war room. Inside, Marcus Brandt was already seated at a long glass table, his tablet connected to a large vertical monitor. As Darius entered, Marcus stood. We have the footage, he said, and more. Walk me through it, Darius said, taking a seat. On screen, the playback began. Timestamp 2113. The moment Brent Callahan, senior flight attendant, smirked and slid the luxury menu aside. His words clear, we've got to prioritize certain guests. The footage cut to the interaction with passenger 1A. Darius's composed reply, the shrug, the dismissive turn. Another clip played, Brent whispering to another crew member, laughing. Then a voice, clearly Brent's, saying, that guy thinks he owns the place. And then, crucially, the other crew member responding, well, maybe if he dressed the part. The room was silent. Darius's jaw flexed. Do we have the overlay logs? Meal tracking? Marcus swiped. Yes, Flight Kitchen loaded 7 luxury meals for 7 first-class seats. Only 6 were served. 1 was redirected mid-flight to passenger 3B, after the kitchen manifest was already confirmed. No changes authorized. And the system shows I pre-ordered? Darius asked. Confirmed, time-stamped, verified, and signed digitally 4 days before departure. There was no doubt left. Not that there had ever been, not in Darius's mind, but now it was codified, tangible, immovable. He stood and walked to the window, staring out at the distant tarmac. The Geneva skyline sparkled faintly behind it, a reminder of the deal he was here to finalize in the morning. But this was just as important. Marcus, he said without turning, did we get Maya's statement? Yes, Marcus replied. She submitted an internal complaint 5 minutes before landing. She's young, terrified, but brave. Her report corroborates the footage almost word for word. She'll need protection, Darius said. She'll have it, Marcus answered firmly. Darius turned to face the screen again. The evidence wasn't just in the footage. It was in the silences, in the gestures, in the patterns. This wasn't an accident. It was habit, culture, endorsed by inaction. We're moving beyond flight protocol now, he said. This is structural. Marcus nodded. Understood. I've already flagged it to legal. But even Marcus didn't realize what Darius was about to do next. He picked up his phone and sent a short, encrypted message to the chairman of the board. Request immediate audit of Stratus Air HR protocols. Need full access to past 5 years of discriminatory claims, resolution outcomes, and dismissal ratios by demographic. Timestamp now. Confidentiality absolute. He set the phone down. This was no longer just about Brent Callahan or a misdelivered meal. It was about a sickness in the company's bloodstream. A few minutes later, another notification buzzed. Marcus looked down. Sir, we've received an anonymous tip from an ex-employee, former flight attendant. Said Brent's been protected before? Twice. Darius inhaled slowly. Get me that file. We're going deep. As the evening deepened in Geneva, the data began pouring in. Footage, logs, witness statements, system metadata, historical complaints, internal cover-ups, crew behavior reports. It was all surfacing now like bones rising from beneath still water. And Darius Coleman, seated in silence, gathered it all, not for vengeance but for accountability. The storm had a file number now, Case 917X, and it had just begun. The silence of the boardroom was pierced only by the low hum of the ventilation system. Darius Coleman stood at the head of the table, back straight, hands clasped loosely in front of him. Not as a man asking for permission, but as one who had already taken control. The assembled senior officers of Stratus Air sat tensely around the long conference table, many of them visibly uncomfortable. Human resources, legal, corporate affairs, and operations had all been summoned. No one had been told why. Until now. "I've convened this meeting," Darius began, "because what happened aboard Flight 917 was not an isolated failure. It was a crystallization of everything we've allowed to go unchecked. No slides, no dramatic music, no theatrics, only cold truth. I've compiled footage, internal reports, and employee testimonies that expose not just misconduct, but a culture of discriminatory bias embedded within this company's service model. And I'm not asking for reactions. I'm giving you notice." Across the table, Director of Operations Charlene Gates shifted uncomfortably. "Darius," she started, her voice measured, "you're describing a cultural issue, not a structural one. We've handled dozens of isolated complaints in the past. Some were, it's turned to friendliness, sononoid." "No," he cut in, his voice sharper now. "You deflected dozens. You minimized, dismissed, or buried them. I reviewed the records myself. 8 complaints against Brent Callahan over the past 5 years. 3 regarding discriminatory treatment. None resulted in disciplinary action." He walked slowly around the room as he spoke, locking eyes with each person in turn. "Do you know how many complaints were filed by Black passengers or staff that led to termination or policy change?" He paused. "1." He let that word hang in the air like a gavel. "1 in 10 years." The general counsel, a cautious woman named Susan Elridge, cleared her throat. "Mr. Coleman, you know as well as anyone that legal action requires precedent, evidence. These incidents often come down to perception, not provable harm." Darius turned toward her, calm but firm. "You're right, and that's why I gathered proof. Here." He tapped the tablet in front of him. The wall screen flickered to life. Surveillance footage played. Brent Callahan laughing at Darius's seat, mocking his clothing, calling him a second-rate CEO trying to look important. No one spoke. Then came the clip of the denied meal, followed by a damning offhand comment. "He should be used to it by now." Silence. Darius looked back at Susan. "Does that meet the burden of proof?" She looked away. "Here's what's going to happen," Darius continued, voice level but icy. "The entire cabin crew of Flight 917 is being terminated, effective immediately. HR has been instructed to process them under Clause 6 of our ethics charter, breach of dignity protocols." Charlene Gates's eyes widened. "You don't have the authority to terminate without a hearing." "I do," he said flatly. "Board-level discretion was granted via emergency resolution this morning. Clause 3.2. You signed it." Charlene's mouth opened, then closed. She had signed it, without reading the fine print. "I'm also launching a top-down audit of our customer experience division. Every flight attendant will undergo mandatory retraining. Our service charter is being rewritten, and the entire bias reporting system replaced, with a model based on real-time monitoring and independent review." He walked back to the head of the table and tapped his phone. The screen switched to a new document, a spreadsheet listing all service-based complaints from the past 5 years, sorted by race, gender, outcome, and whether action had been taken. "Take a look. Look at the patterns. Then tell me this company doesn't have a systemic problem." No one could. Susan leaned forward, her voice softer now. "What about the PR implications? If this becomes public, we'll have to answer for every unaddressed case." "We should," Darius said. The weight of those 2 words silenced the room again. He wasn't afraid of exposure. He welcomed it. For too long, fear had shielded the status quo, but exposure was a disinfectant. Today, we stop performing empathy. We start living it. A murmur of assent came from 2 younger executives, but others sat frozen. They weren't ready for this kind of change. Not yet. That didn't matter. Darius didn't need consensus. He needed momentum. He turned toward the screen once more, showing the still image of the flight attendant placing the sandwich in front of him. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the symbolism of being overlooked, diminished, dismissed. Then he addressed the room one last time. This company has two options. We either become a symbol of transformation or a case study in corporate decay. The cameras were rolling. The world is watching. What happens next defines who we are. He didn't wait for applause and he walked out. The echo of his footsteps down the marble hallway was the only sound left in the boardroom. Behind closed doors, the confrontation was over. But outside, the reckoning had just begun. Within 24 hours of Darius Coleman's confrontation, a corporate earthquake shook the very foundations of Stratus Air. The board had tried to keep things quiet, initially. Press releases were drafted in cautious language. Internal realignment, customer experience restructuring, and policy review. But you can't silence a storm once it's already broken over the mountain. The firings hit industry news by morning. Entire cabin crew fired mid-flight by Stratus board member. Racial bias allegations shake luxury airline. Silent CEO delivers loudest corporate wake-up call in aviation history. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #StratusFail and #FlyFair trended within hours. Videos were clipped, analyzed, reshared. Anonymous employee testimonies surfaced, revealing similar microaggressions buried over the years, ignored or brushed aside with corporate platitudes. Darius didn't engage. He didn't need to. The world was doing that work for him now. But what the world didn't see, at least not yet, was what had begun inside the company itself. A reckoning, swift and surgical. The internal audit team, headed by Marcus Brandt, Darius's trusted chief of operations, worked day and night. They uncovered rot in every corridor, discriminatory hiring patterns in premium services, promotion bias in staff leadership, and a culture of silent complicity. Darius had expected resistance. What surprised him was how fast the silence cracked. Employees began speaking up. An older attendant from the Tokyo division emailed him directly. "Mr. Coleman, I served 32 years. I saw what they did to you, and I've seen worse. Thank you for making it stop." A former black pilot, long gone from Stratus due to what HR had called interpersonal friction, returned with documentation that validated past claims of bias. One after another, stories came pouring in, swept away no longer. Meanwhile, the PR team scrambled. The media frenzy only intensified when someone leaked a snippet of the surveillance footage, the infamous sandwich placement, followed by the dismissive shrug. It wasn't graphic. It wasn't loud. But it was undeniable. No statement could spin what had been captured on video. A journalist from The Atlantic wrote, "It's not the volume of the insult that matters. It's the silence of its acceptance." Coleman's quiet, deliberate strategy has shown us that power isn't always about shouting. Sometimes it's about choosing when to speak and when not to. Back inside headquarters, Darius began dismantling the culture brick by brick. He started with the leadership team. Each executive was summoned individually into a closed-door meeting. They weren't confronted with accusations. They were shown evidence, not of what they had done directly, but what they had permitted, tolerated, overlooked. Charlene Gates, director of ops, was the first to go. She sat across from Darius, pale but poised, her hands folded tightly. "You're letting me go because of Brent," she said, more indignant than regretful. "No," Darius replied. "I'm letting you go because you created an environment where Brent thrived." She didn't fight it. She just nodded once, stood, and walked out. Her silence said more than any rebuttal could have. By the end of the week, 6 high-ranking executives were gone. In their place, Darius promoted a new generation of leaders, not just for optics, but for substance. Individuals from marginalized backgrounds who had previously been overlooked. Employees with spotless records who had been stuck behind invisible walls. And they came with ideas. One introduced a mentorship program, pairing junior staff with leadership mentors from different departments. Another suggested replacing subjective performance reviews with data-driven evaluations. Yet another proposed implementing a real-time passenger feedback dashboard that reported to the executive team directly, unfiltered. Every reform was approved. The shift wasn't superficial, it was foundational. But reforming the internal structure wasn't enough. The world was still watching. Darius knew the media would be back for an answer. and he was ready to give them one. He called a press conference. It was held not in the company's sleek media room, but at the maintenance hangar of JFK Airport, where the workers wore grease-stained uniforms and rarely saw a CEO face-to-face. Journalists were puzzled at first, but when Darius stepped onto the makeshift podium with the roar of jet engines behind him, they understood. "This is where it starts," he said, gesturing behind him. "From the ground up. That's how you rebuild trust. No teleprompters, no script. Just Darius, a man who had been humiliated in silence, and who now stood in authority, with a plan. I was dismissed on one of my own aircraft, not because I broke a rule, not because of a system error, but because someone decided I didn't belong. That ends today." He laid out his reform strategy point by point, real changes, with timelines, with accountability structures, and with a clear message. We're not asking to be trusted, we're earning it. Reporters fired off questions, but Darius didn't flinch. "Are you suing the airline?" "Number, I'm transforming it." "Do you think racism is a widespread issue in aviation?" "I think silence is the bigger issue." As the conference ended, the applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. From employees, from watchers, from those who had felt that same quiet exclusion and now saw someone doing more than just tweeting about it. Back in his office later that night, Darius stood by the window, watching a Stratus airplane taxi toward takeoff. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply said to Marcus, standing beside him, "We cracked the shell." Marcus nodded. "Now we clean the egg." Darius turned, eyes sharp with quiet fire. "No," he said. "Now we build a new nest." 3 weeks after the scandal, Stratus Air didn't just look different on the surface, it was different. From the moment passengers walked into the terminal, the energy had shifted. Gone was the icy, pretentious, first-class check-in counter with indifferent glances and half-smiles. Now they were greeted by trained hospitality professionals who had been carefully vetted, not just for credentials, but for empathy, for cultural awareness, for real human understanding. This was Darius Coleman's blueprint in action. He hadn't installed reforms and walked away. No, he had embedded himself into the process, personally overseeing the internal rebirth directive, a cross-department initiative designed to burn away the rot and replace it with a living, breathing system of accountability, equity, and excellence. The flight crews were now being retrained under a new leadership model called the Mirror Standard. It didn't just teach service etiquette, it taught employees to see themselves in every passenger. "You serve your reflection," the training booklet read, "and how you treat that reflection defines the legacy you leave in the sky." It was poetic, but it was also enforceable. Real-time feedback dashboards track staff performance not just through complaints, but through live commendations collected via the airline's upgraded app, and those metrics were tied to promotions. Respect had become currency. Back at headquarters, Marcus Brandt ran operations with military precision. He had personally installed a direct report hotline for anonymous crew complaints, bypassing middle management entirely. "Cut the noise," he'd said. "Let the truth rise straight to the top." One of the first callers was a former junior attendant who said, "For the first time in 7 years, I feel safe enough to speak." That message was replayed in training sessions, becoming a battle cry for the cultural shift. But not everyone was thrilled. Behind closed doors, a few executives grumbled. A faction within the old guard, those who had grown comfortable in their roles under the former culture, resisted the change. They called Darius dramatic, said he was overcorrecting, that he was throwing away decades of tradition. He knew this resistance would come, so he invited it, head on. In a now legendary executive roundtable meeting, Darius walked into the room holding a sealed envelope. He placed it at the center of the conference table, then sat back and looked each dissenting executive in the eye. "What's in the envelope?" one of them finally asked. Darius leaned forward. "A list of your replacement candidates." The room went dead silent. "I don't need threats," he said. "I need allies. You want to be part of the future? Then lead like it. Otherwise, I'll find people who will." No one pushed back after that. Meanwhile, outside of the boardroom walls, the passengers had begun to notice. Social media, which had once been a battleground of criticism, slowly transformed. Influencers, journalists, Even casual flyers began posting about the noticeable changes. Stratus just served me and my disabled brother like royalty. Not because we're rich, because they see people now. At Travels with Jay. Notice the all-new diverse crew on my latest flight. The vibe? Human, respectful, efficient. This is what every airline should be. At Dr. Leslie Nguyen. But it wasn't just about PR or optics. The company's internal culture had also begun to hum with purpose. At the maintenance hangar in Dallas, a young black technician named Ronaldo was promoted for the first time in 8 years. He didn't cry, but his wife did. She emailed the airline personally, "Thank you for giving my husband what no one else did, recognition." In Miami, an openly queer flight attendant received a standing ovation during a monthly staff meeting after being named the company's ambassador of inclusion. These weren't token moments. They were signs of something real, something reborn. And at the center of it all stood Darius Coleman, not just as the CEO or the man who fired a crew, but as the architect of a system that finally aligned prestige with principle. But he wasn't finished. On the 30th day of the Rebirth Directive, Darius announced the launch of Flight 917 Initiative, named after the very flight where it all began. It would fund scholarships for aviation students from underrepresented communities, support unconscious bias training across every tier of the airline industry, and establish a watchdog council to hold all airline leaders, Stratus included, accountable to international service standards. Reporters asked why he named the initiative after a flight linked to discrimination. His answer was simple: because we don't bury mistakes here. We transform them. And then he added, Flight 917 was the day I was reminded what silence feels like. This initiative ensures no one has to feel that again. Darius's words were quoted in boardrooms, classrooms, and think tanks around the world, and the message spread. Other airlines quietly began updating their policies. Industry magazines shifted their editorials from profit margins to passenger dignity. Aviation schools began requesting guest lectures from Darius on inclusive leadership. Even lawmakers started citing Flight 917 in regulatory debates about passenger rights. The story had gone beyond the cabin. It had become a movement, a rebirth. One evening, as Darius sat on a red-eye flight to Johannesburg, the flight attendant, middle-aged, soft-spoken, with calloused hands and kind eyes, approached him mid-flight. "I've worked in the skies for 27 years, she said, handing him a warm towel. "This job, it feels different now. Better." Darius looked up, quietly absorbing her words. Then he nodded once. "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way." Because the sky wasn't just where Darius flew, it was where he rebuilt the world, one flight at a time. The headlines faded. The viral tweets slowed. The world, as it always does, moved on. But for Darius Coleman, the work continued. 3 months after Flight 917, he sat alone in the executive observation deck of Stratus Air's New York headquarters, a glass dome overlooking the skyline, built originally for investor schmoozing, now transformed into something else. This was where Darius came to think, to measure not profits, but progress. The sky outside was the color of steel, quiet, massive, and above all, open. Much like the future he'd fought for. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Marcus Brandt stepped in with his usual efficient stride, holding a leather-bound folder. "It's done," Marcus said. Darius didn't look surprised. He simply nodded and opened the folder. Inside, a full independent audit of Stratus Air's cultural reforms. The numbers were staggering. Complaints of discrimination down 87%. First-time passenger satisfaction up 34%. Promotion rate for underrepresented staff increased by 59%. Internal morale, as surveyed by Gallup, hit an all-time company high. Darius closed the folder slowly. "We're not finished," he said. "No," Marcus replied, "but we're no longer failing either." That distinction mattered. What began as a moment of humiliation over a denied meal had become something bigger than even Darius expected. It had spread like wildfire, not in destruction, but in rebirth. Universities began citing the Flight 917 incident in leadership seminars. Airlines across Europe and Asia quietly adopted Darius's passenger dignity model. Even the FAA had reached out, inviting him to consult on new industry guidelines for bias prevention and cultural accountability. But Darius remained focused not on scale, but on sustainability. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was building legacy. And legacy, he understood, wasn't about being remembered. It was about remembering who you were when no one was watching. That was the lesson. Because in truth, the Flight 917 story wasn't extraordinary because it was rare. It was extraordinary because it was common. Every day across thousands of flights, people were dismissed, overlooked, quietly humiliated in ways small enough to be ignored, but cumulative enough to destroy a soul. And most walked away in silence. But Darius hadn't. He had chosen not to explode in rage. He had chosen not to settle for apologies. He had chosen instead to build, to rebuild, to reimagine, not just for himself, but for every passenger who had ever been told without words, "You don't belong here." And now they did. Stratus Air became the first airline to implement a new seating protocol called Respect Class, not a literal section, but a training ethos that applied to every passenger, every seat, every interaction. It wasn't about food, it was about dignity, and it spread. Hotels began calling it the Coleman model. Luxury car services adopted the Flight 917 pledge, promising that every passenger, regardless of dress, accent, or skin tone, would be greeted with equal deference. But Darius didn't take credit. He simply kept building. His final move came quietly, without press, without spectacle. He created the Flight 917 Foundation, seeding it with $25 million of his own money. Its mission? To fund grassroots programs that fight everyday injustice in travel, education, and healthcare. Places where subtle prejudice hides in smiles, in procedures, in so-called professionalism. Because he understood, racism isn't always shouted. Sometimes it whispers. And so the foundation listened. It trained nurses to recognize unconscious bias in ERs. It paid for mystery audits at five-star hotels. It built scholarships for future pilots from underserved communities. It gave grants to ex-stewards who had been pushed out for speaking up. And on the one-year anniversary of Flight 917, it hosted a silent vigil on every Stratus Air flight. No announcements, no fanfare. Just a card in every seat back pocket. It read, "We remember, we rebuild, we rise." This flight is dedicated to every person who's ever been told, "This seat isn't for you." It is. Passengers took photos. Some cried, some simply nodded. But all of them understood. And somewhere at 36,000 feet, in seat 1A, Darius Coleman sat quietly. No one disturbed him. No one needed to. The cabin crew knew who he was. More importantly, they knew why he was. As the flight neared its destination, a young boy and coach, a black child traveling alone for the first time, peeked down the aisle toward first class. A new steward, trained under the rebirth directive, bent down and asked, "You want to see where the captain flies?" The boy nodded. He was escorted all the way to the cockpit. Darius saw the moment, but didn't interfere. He simply smiled. This was the victory. Not in firings, not in speeches, but in systems that now saw what the old world refused to. The boy returned to his seat, beaming. And for the first time in a long time, the skies felt fair. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to catch more gripping stories like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.